Good morning, students. Welcome to the second class of Victorian Age. In today's class, we are going to discuss 3 points. The first point is the literary characteristics of the age. The second point is the literary movements of the Victorian age. And in the third point, we are going to discuss the conflict between science and religion. So let us take the first part, the literary characteristics of the Victorian age. The Victorian period was a high point in the history of English literature, which produced a number of prominent writers such as Charles Dickens, the Brontes, the Brownings, and Oscar Wilde. Writers of this age were perceptive to numerous changes occurring during this period and reflected upon these in their writings. Dickens, for instance, commented on the effects of the poor laws in his novels. Tennyson and Browning represented the two pillars of Victorian poetry, and the dramatic monologue was the preferred mode of expression. However, even though these poets flourished in the early part of the Victorian period, the novel became the form most chosen by writers later during this period. The poet Arthur Hugh Clarke attests to this fact when he remarks that the modern novel is preferred to the modern poem. The Victorian period also witnessed tremendous growth in periodicals of all kinds. Many famous novelists such as Charles Dickens published their work in series installments in magazines. Also, the works of early and mid-Victorian novelists, especially George Eliot, were marked by a moral purpose. Literature for children also developed in the Victorian age as a separate genre. Works of Lewis Carroll from 1832 to 1898, author of Alice's Adventure in Wonderland 1865 and Through the Looking Glass 1865, and adventure novels such as those by Robert Louis Stevenson written between 1850 to 1894, Treasure Island 1883, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde 1886 became well known. Frederick Harrison describes Victorian literature as brilliant, diverse and complex. Defining the spirit of the Victorian age, he states, "The Victorian age, it is true, has no Shakespeare or Milton, no Bacon or Hume, no Fielding or Scott, no supreme master in poetry, philosophy or romance, whose work is incorporated with the thought of the world, who is destined to form epochs and to endure for centuries. Its genius is more scientific than literary, more historical than dramatic, greater in discovery than in abstract thought." So much so for the first point, that is the literary characteristics of the Victorian age. We take up the second point, that is the literary movements of the Victorian age. The first movement that we discuss is the Oxford movement. Oxford movement was a 19th century movement centered at the University of Oxford that sought renewal of Roman Catholic thought and practice within the Church of England. Immediate cause of the movement was the change that took place in the relationship between the state and the Church of England. The igniting factor was the proposal of the Whig government to support half the Anglican bishops and redispose their incomes without first consulting the Church. This created a wave of opposition spearheaded by John Cablet, John Henry Newman and others. John Henry Newman dated the beginning of the Oxford movement to Cablet's Essex sermon of July 1833 on national apostasy. Other figures associated with this movement were Richard Froude, Frederick Father, Isaac Williams, Charles Marrott, William Ward and many more. Although it was primarily a religious movement, its main connection with literature was the series of doctrinal papers setting forth the aims and teachings of the movement. These were named as the Tracts for the Times. There was a series of 90 theological publications produced by the members of the Oxford movement and edited by John Newman, who himself contributed 24 tracts. W. H. Hutton states in this context, "The Oxford movement certainly belongs to the history of English religion more definitely than to the history of English literature. But it had great influence outside its own definite members on the literary taste of its age." The second movement that we discuss is the aesthetic movement. The aesthetic movement was launched during the later part of the 19th century and emphasized aesthetic values over moral or social themes in literature and other arts. It was a reaction against utilitarian philosophies, predominance of scientific thinking, and the widespread belief of the middle classes that art should have a moral purpose. The movement drew upon the formula of I art pour for art's sake, articulated most memorably by the French novelist Théophile Gautier in his 1836 preface to Mademoiselle de Maupin. Gautier was one of a number of French writers and artists of the period who argued that art should be evaluated with reference to its own criteria. While the historical roots of the movement can be traced back to Immanuel Kante's critique of judgment, written in 1790. The movement was brought into England by Walter Pater, who in the Renaissance 1873 remarked that the love of art for its own sake. He believed art produced pleasurable sensations that added up to an impression of beauty. The third most important movement in the Victorian age is the Pre-Raphaelite movement. Pre-Raphaelites were a group of artists, poets and painters first formed in 1848 who rejected the dramatic, artificial mannerisms painting styles succeeding Raphael and Michelangelo. The term Pre-Raphaelite aimed to create more genuine, humble representations of their subjects. The Pre-Raphaelites Brotherhood was formed by three Royal Academy students, D.G. Rossetti, who was a gifted poet as well as a painter, William Holman Hunt and John Avery Méliès. They were later joined by William Margaret Rossetti, James Collinson, Thomas Woolner and F.G. Stephens. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was based on the following principles: to have genuine ideas to express, to study nature attentively, to sympathize with what is direct and serious and heartfelt in previous art, and to defy all conventions of art. The ideals of this group of painters and artists were taken over by a literary movement which included D.G. Rossetti, Christina Rossetti, William Morris and Algernon Charles Swinburne. In poetry, the movement came in the shape of a revolt against contemporary poetry of the kind of Tennyson's, which was full of tradition and involved in the immediate, mundane problems of contemporary society. The Pre-Raphaelites also started a periodical called The Germ in 1850, which outlined their aesthetic theories. The most famous literary work associated with the Pre-Raphaelites was D.G. Rossetti's poem The Blessed Damsel. The Scottish poet and critic Robert Buchan criticized the Pre-Raphaelite school of poetry and termed it as fleshy school of poetry. It was a term of abuse coined by him to attack the explicit nature of subject matter as well as erotic imagery in the poetry of poets such as Rossetti, Swinburne and William Morris. Buchan identified Rossetti as a leader of this group whose followers had taken a vow. Now the third point that we discuss in today's class is the conflict between science and religion. During the early part of the 19th century, science and religion existed in harmony with each other. Science was believed to be in the interest of divine revelation. However, as new scientific developments and the developments of biblical criticism came into being, man's faith in God and religion began to be questioned, leading to a crisis of faith. In 1859, Charles Darwin published his book The Origin of Species, in which he laid out the theory of evolution. Darwin's proposition that instead of being created by some higher power, man actually evolved from a lower species was seen as a contrary to the teachings of the Bible, which taught that man was created in God's image. Darwin also argued that species with useful adaptations to the environment are more likely to survive and produce progeny than those with less useful adaptations. Darwinian theories contradicted the notion, central to Christianity and many other faiths, that man had a special, God-given place in the natural order. Instead, proponents of evolution pointed to signs of human anatomy, remnants of a tailbone, for instance, showing common ancestry with other mammals. The Darwinian thesis was further built upon the publication of Huxley's Man's Place in Nature, 1863, Lallet's The Antiquity of Man, 1863, and by Darwin himself in The Descent of Man, 1871. Huxley articulated the religious conflict of his age and questioned, does God exist? How can we know him? Why isn't he revealed more unambiguously in the scriptures? Why would he create evil and why would he allow the good to suffer and the wicked to flourish? Does he intervene miraculously in this world? He coined the term agnosticism to express his religious skepticism and stated that the essence of it lay in the following reason. He further added that every man should be able to give a reason for the faith that is in him, and if there is no tangible reason, there can be no faith. Apart from new scientific discoveries, a new range of biblical critics also appeared who delved into the Bible only to raise question marks above several of its aspects. One of these was David Frederick Strauss, who in his Life of Jews 1835 doubts about the reliability of the New Testament. Doubt became the order of the day in the Victorian England. It was no longer a religious sin, it became a necessity, keeping in mind the rapid developments of the age. So in today's class, we have discussed the 3 points, the literary characteristics, the literary movements, and the conflicts between science and religion. In tomorrow's class, we are going to take up the important poets of the Victorian age. Thank you.